Hello everybody, my name is Ali and welcome to my 2D C++ game video. The task was to create a 2D shooting game using C++. While developing the game, some research was done into the SDL library to understand its features and functions slightly better. Other than external research, some internal research also took place through looking at the Moodle site, where tutorials could be followed and, with a little bit of understanding, altered to fit into the main game. Apart from research, some mathematical solutions were also used, such as a distance formula to calculate how far the bullet can travel from the player before being destroyed, as well as calculating the distance between the bullet and the enemy for collision purposes. In terms of the internal class structure, each item has its own class: the music, the font, the player, the enemy, the tile map, the pathfinding, the bullet, the particles, the game loop, and lastly the main function itself. You can see a UML diagram to show you how the classes are used. As for testing methods, only one was used, which was to build the solution after making a few changes to see if any syntax errors would come up. If the build succeeded, then there would be no problems. Otherwise, the errors would be fixed. Moving on, here are some performance metrics from the final game build. As you can see, it takes less than 1 GB of memory space. The only reason it takes that much is because of the audio files, the background, as well as the sound effects. In terms of CPU usage, the usage stays relatively low, hovering around 20%. The render function taking the most CPU, as it is rendering the player, the enemy, and the tile map. As for GPU usage, it also stays low and shows no drop in frames, seen from the red line staying at 60 frames per second, which is the highest the monitor could go. As for the game itself, here are some features. The player can shoot at enemies using the spacebar key. The bullet gets destroyed once it reaches a certain distance from the player or collides with the enemy. The bullet itself is stored in a vector, so it can be used over and over again instead of creating a new bullet each time. This helps to use less memory. For the collisions with the bullet and the enemy, as well as the enemy and the island, they both use a box collider for collision. The game's tile maps are made using multiple small images to form one big tile map. The player cannot go outside of the island through tile map collisions. To make the water look alive, the tile maps are changing at a constant pace to give it that effect. In terms of the user interface or UI, the player has a score that counts up as they destroy the ships, portrayed through a text UI and a lives counter next to it, using a text as well as a non-text UI using a green bar that reduces as lives are lost. As previously talked about, the game has a code profile testing, which was not only conducted at the end, but also each week as any changes were made. The first profiling was done on the first week of December. Not much was added in the game at that point, so the memory usage was low. The second time code profiling was done on the 1st of January 2022. A lot more features were added, so the memory usage was doubled. The last time it was conducted was on the 6th of January 2022. By that time, the game was ready. The only thing added to the game was audio. The memory usage shot up to almost 1 GB because of the large audio file. As for code optimization, both heap and stack were used to store the data. This helped to increase loading times and performance measures. Another way the code was optimized was to get rid of redundant code that wasn't being used anymore, such as the player movement through keyboard controls. For animations, following the 12 basic principles of animation, the game uses a secondary animation technique where the enemies approaching from the top and bottom are moving towards the island and are also spinning to make the game interesting. Next up, the game also has background audio as well as sound effects for when the bullets hit the enemy. The game's tile map is being read from an external file in the assets folder. As for additional features, the game has a main menu and a game over screen with play and quit buttons, as well as purple particles. When the game finishes, the game over screen shows their score. The code uses object pooling. One example is for font rendering. The game loop can define the X and Y position as well as the type and size of the font, so the game can have multiple different font sizes and types from one function instead of creating multiple functions for different fonts, types, and sizes. Another example is in the enemy code, where instead of creating a new player object, the enemy code gets the player from the game loop class code, where its constructor is being called. As previously mentioned, the game has audio and the tile maps are being loaded using an external file. Lastly, the player can move at the location the player clicks on the island using A-star pathfinding. The building in the middle is the player's house, so the user cannot click on it to move the player on top. For the last point, the strengths of the game are that it uses a lot of different techniques like sound, animation, and pathfinding to make it a unique and interesting game. Some of the other interesting things about the game's internal code and structure were that everything was organized and set so that they went to their respective places in the game loop. Some of the weaknesses were that the difficulty didn't increase over time. The pathfinding algorithm used a 32x24-bit tile map for collision, whereas the tile map was a 20x16 one. I also wanted to store the player's score in a database so it could be used again. Another one was that I wanted to reduce the loading time or have a loading screen to show that the game was loading. Lastly, I wanted to further optimize my code to improve the loading timer. Now, here is the non-narrative and non-text overlay gameplay.